Imagine a king so feared, so untouchable, and so powerful in life that no one dared to question him, yet in death he became the victim of one of the most horrifying fates imaginable, a burial while still alive, suffocating in the darkness of his own tomb as his people unknowingly celebrated the end of his reign. This chilling story begins not with his death, but with the unraveling of his body and mind in the days leading up to his supposed passing, where fever, delirium, and the crude medical practices of the medieval world combined to create the perfect nightmare, for while his doctors pronounced him dead, the truth was far more sinister. He was trapped in the fragile space between life and death, fully conscious as his body was prepared for burial, stripped of dignity, and entombed in a coffin that would become his prison. Imagine the terror that must have gripped him as he felt the weight of stones above, the muffled cries of mourners fading into silence, and the chilling realization that his royal status, his wealth, and his armies meant nothing in the face of being buried alive. For in that moment he was no longer a king, but a man clawing for breath in suffocating darkness, every inhale growing shallower as panic consumed him, every scream swallowed by earth and wood, until his own coffin echoed with the sound of his fists beating against it, unheard by anyone above. The truth about this burial is not just grotesque, it is revealing of the terrifying ignorance of the time when rulers trusted physicians who misread comas as death, and priests who rushed funerals for fear of disease, sealing kings and commoners alike into eternal prisons before their final breath had left their bodies. And this king's ordeal became infamous not because of what he accomplished in life, but because of the horror he endured in death, a horror so great that whispers spread through Europe claiming it was divine punishment for his sins, with servants later reporting that when his tomb was reopened years later, his body was not in repose but twisted in grotesque positions, hands clawing at the coffin lid, fingernails broken, teeth shattered, as if death itself had been resisted until the final, agonizing second. Some claimed his ghost roamed the halls of his palace, screaming in rage at the betrayal of those who failed to save him, while others swore that the unexplained scratching sounds heard in the crypt were his eternal struggle against the suffocating darkness. But beyond superstition lies a darker truth. This story exposes just how fragile human life was in an age ruled by superstition, ignorance, and blind faith in authority, where even kings could not escape the terror of being buried alive, their last moments not of peace, but of desperation, panic, and unimaginable horror. The shocking secret of this king's fate is more than a grotesque footnote in history. It is a reminder that power, wealth, and glory mean nothing when death comes too soon, or worse, when it comes too late, leaving a man to be celebrated as dead while he still fought for his life beneath the crushing silence of his own grave. In the aftermath of the king's horrifying fate, whispers began to spread through his kingdom, whispers that turned into legends, and legends that transformed into cautionary tales so chilling that they outlived his reign. But to understand why his burial alive struck such terror into the hearts of his subjects, you have to look deeper into the man he truly was, for this was no beloved ruler cut down too soon, but a tyrant whose cruelty had poisoned his own legacy long before his body was lowered into the grave, and many believed that his premature entombment was not a mistake of medicine, but a punishment from forces far beyond human understanding, a divine retribution for the decades of misery he inflicted upon his people. Here was a king who taxed villages into starvation to fund his endless wars, who built palaces dripping in gold while peasants ate dirt to survive, who crushed dissent with such ferocity that entire families disappeared overnight, leaving empty houses as silent warnings to anyone who dared question his rule. And yet in the end it was not an assassin's blade or a soldier's revolt that brought him down, but the slow rot of his own body, a body weakened by gluttony, indulgence, and a desperate obsession with immortality that led him to consume elixirs, potions, and poisons disguised as cures until his veins ran thick with the very toxins meant to preserve him. The irony was cruel, for the man who claimed divine right to rule could not even control his own mortality, and when his physicians stood over his limp form and declared him dead, it was less science than surrender. They could not save him, so they buried him, their haste fueled by fear of contagion and the stench of decay. Yet in that rush they sealed him into his coffin while his heart still fought to beat and his lungs still clawed for air. Some historians insist that this story is exaggerated, that later accounts embellished his suffering for dramatic effect. But the truth lies in the details of what was found when his tomb was disturbed: the splintered wood, shattered teeth, the shredded fabric of his burial clothes, all physical evidence of a struggle that no corpse should have endured. And whether divine punishment or tragic accident, the people of his era believed only one thing: their king had been swallowed by the earth alive, a fitting end for a ruler who had treated them like expendable pawns. The terror of his burial reshaped his legacy, for even centuries later parents told their children the tale of the cruel king who screamed beneath the soil, not as a story of sorrow, but as a lesson that no throne, no crown, no army can save a man from justice when it comes in the form of slow, suffocating death. His memory became not a symbol of majesty, but a ghostly warning, a figure cursed to be remembered not for his victories, but for the unspeakable horror of being buried alive while the world above celebrated his downfall. The story of the king's premature burial does not end with his suffocation beneath the earth, because the consequences of that mistake rippled outward, infecting the minds of his people and shaping the paranoia of an entire era. For once word spread that a monarch had been buried alive, suddenly no one, noble or peasant, trusted death itself, and fear took hold so strongly that new customs, rituals, and even inventions emerged in a desperate attempt to ensure that the same horrific fate would not befall others. Coffins began to be designed with bells, strings, and tiny windows, so that if the so-called corpse awoke in the grave, they could call for help, and the phrase "saved by the bell" was born not in classrooms but in graveyards, where terrified families listened in silence for the faint chime that meant someone beneath the dirt was still clawing at life. Yet even with such precautions, the terror was never truly eased, because the king's ordeal had exposed how fragile the boundary between life and death really was in a world without modern medicine. Priests whispered prayers at funerals not only for souls, but to guard against restless bodies that might stir beneath the soil, while doctors, still ignorant of comas, catalepsy, and seizures, hid their failures behind grand declarations of death, fearing that hesitation might make them appear weak. And so countless burials became rushed affairs, sealing people in darkness while their hearts still faintly beat. This paranoia infected the culture so deeply that entire generations began to see coffins not as sacred vessels but as cages, places where the unlucky might awaken to scratch, scream, and slowly suffocate in isolation, and all of it traced back to the king whose death had been anything but final, a monarch whose power was mocked by his inability to command his own fate, whose desperate struggle beneath the soil became a metaphor for the corruption of his reign. His story inspired playwrights, poets, and storytellers who painted him not as a tragic figure, but as a grotesque reminder of the arrogance of rulers who believed themselves untouchable. And even centuries later, ghostly rumors swirled of scratching heard from his tomb, of muffled wails carried on the wind near his burial site, and of tormented apparitions wandering palace corridors, their faces twisted in eternal suffocation. The impact of his burial reached far beyond horror. It became a cultural scar, a reminder that kings were as vulnerable as the peasants they oppressed, and that no crown could protect against the cruelty of error or the hand of fate. And in this way his legacy lived on, not through monuments or victories, but through the universal fear he embodied, the nightmare of being buried alive, conscious yet powerless, while the world above moved on without you, convinced you were gone forever. As centuries passed, the horrifying tale of the king who suffocated beneath the earth refused to fade into silence, instead mutating into folklore that blended history with nightmare, because in every retelling his suffering became darker, his cries more desperate, his punishment more divine, until his burial was no longer seen as an accident of medicine, but as a judgment carried out by unseen hands, a cosmic justice for a ruler whose cruelty had drenched his kingdom in blood. Peasants swore that his ghost still clawed at the walls of his crypt on stormy nights, and some even claimed that the scratches on his coffin lid never stopped growing, as if he was still trapped inside, endlessly struggling, condemned to relive his suffocation again and again for eternity. And these legends spread far beyond his borders, reaching other courts and monarchs who secretly trembled at the idea that even their crowns could not save them from such a fate. Rulers began to obsessively demand proof of death before their bodies were entombed. Some ordered guards to keep watch for days after they died. Others demanded that knives pierce their hearts before burial. And still others arranged for their bodies to be left in open chambers for weeks to ensure the stench of decay confirmed the finality of their end, because no one wanted to become the next ghost king scratching at a coffin beneath soil. The story even bled into religion, where preachers thundered from pulpits that his burial alive was a warning from heaven, a vivid reminder that sin and arrogance could trap even a king in hellish suffering, while others whispered that the devil himself had orchestrated the ordeal to mock humanity's desperate faith in power and ritual. In this way, the king's fate transformed him from a man of flesh and blood into a mythic figure of dread, a shadow hovering over every funeral and burial in the medieval world, a silent voice whispering in every mourner's ear, what if they are not truly gone? What if they are still breathing beneath the shroud? And it was this paranoia, seeded by his suffocation, that turned cemeteries into places of terror and made death itself a mystery feared more than ever. For the king's second life underground was not one of resurrection, but of agony, proving that sometimes the worst fate imaginable is not dying too soon, but dying too late, with no one willing to listen to the screams rising from beneath the soil. And so we arrive at the final chapter of this king's macabre legacy, a tale that outlived the man himself and became a mirror for humanity's deepest fears, because while his reign was once marked by conquest, cruelty, and a throne of splendor, history has reduced him to one chilling image, a monarch gasping for air in a coffin of wood and stone, clawing desperately as the weight of the world pressed down upon him. His story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth, that death is not always peaceful, and that the rituals meant to honor the dead can sometimes become prisons that magnify their suffering, a reminder that ignorance, arrogance, and haste are as dangerous as swords on the battlefield. But perhaps the darkest irony of all is that in trying to escape mortality through wealth, indulgence, and power, this king ended up achieving a form of immortality far crueler than he ever imagined. For centuries later he is remembered not as a ruler who built palaces or led armies, but as the monarch who was buried alive while still breathing, his name spoken in whispers as both a warning and a curse, a symbol of how the mighty can fall in the most humiliating and terrifying ways. The peasants who once trembled before him found solace in the idea that his final moments were filled with panic and despair, while future kings, terrified by his fate, demanded ever more elaborate protections against premature burial. Yet none could escape the haunting shadow of his story, which loomed over every tomb, every coffin, every sealed crypt. Even today, his legacy lingers in the cultural imagination, inspiring ghost stories, cautionary legends, and a fascination with the thin line between life and death. And in that way he achieved a strange kind of eternity. Not the eternity of glory he sought, but the eternity of fear, for as long as humans dread the possibility of waking beneath the earth, they will remember the shocking secret of the king who was buried alive while still breathing, a man who discovered too late that the greatest horror is not what awaits after death, but what happens when death itself refuses to come quickly.